you all to this last of our lecture series. It's been a really nice ride. They've been very interesting and very useful, and I hope people who have come have enjoyed them as much as we have enjoyed putting them on for you. So please keep in mind that the Preservation Society will continue to have programs, will continue to have events, and that I hope you people will support us in those events and support our fundraising for the Robert Longhouse. I'm going to turn this over now to David to introduce our guests and to get us going.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? If you can't, raise your hands if you can hear. Oh, okay, everybody can hear me. All right, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program. I am David Gleason, and I am the chairman of the 250th Anniversary Committee for the Robert Longhouse. And as this 250th anniversary year of 2015 comes to an end, I'd just like to take a moment to remark on the dramatic and politically volatile events of 1765. It is in this pivotal year in American history that Long completes his house on Ann Street. And even as Robert Long stood on the porch of his newly constructed house, the events of the year signaled the beginnings of the major conflict between the colonies and Great Britain leading up to the Revolutionary War and the end of the status quo of colonial life. The Stamp Act, a greatly protested tax on the colonies, went into effect on November 21st, 1765, just as Robert Long began to contemplate his rising fortunes in Fells Point. Within 15 years, the colonial world he knew would be completely gone, and the new experiment in government was beginning. Certainly this house reflects Long's faith and belief in this new government and its abilities to reinvent itself, to grow and to prosper for the benefit of all its citizens. So in that spirit, the Preservation Society presents the fourth in a series of events marking the anniversary, which were designed to examine in depth the multi-layered history of Fells Point that reflects not only local influences, but also the influence of global events. Tonight, the Society will focus on the role of preservation and how it has played in the rebirth of Fells Point. In the 1950s, if anybody can remember the 1950s, Fells Point's fortunes had dropped to a point where real estate in the neighborhood had little or no value. As a matter of fact, there were no realtors in the neighborhood. And the city's best planning efforts resulted in an ill-conceived and potentially catastrophic attempt to route an interstate highway through the most historic sections. Through the efforts of the newly developed preservation movement in the 1960s, Fells Point was spared the highway, and over 50 years has become one of the most vital neighborhoods in Baltimore. Tonight's panel discussion will focus on the effects of preservation, both the pros and cons, and look to the future of the preservation movement in Baltimore and how it can be an effective tool in revitalization as it has been the case in Fells Point. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel. Charlie Duff. Charlie will be moderator tonight, and Charlie is Executive Director of Jubilee, Baltimore. Tom Stosur, Director of Planning. Tom has been with the Planning Director since 2009. Mel Freeman. Mel is the Executive Director of CPHA, and rounding out the panel will be Joe Cronyn. Joe is a principal in Lipman, Frizzell, and Mitchell, a real estate counseling and appraisal firm. I've done a lot of work in promoting redevelopment in historic districts. So with that, I'd like to ask the panel to sort of give a couple of minutes of their perspectives on preservation in their particular field. And then I'll ask Charlie to start with a question, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Tom, would you like to begin?
No.
I mean, I was planning to go third, like
Right.
the order here.
Yes,
No,
Is that okay?
yes, I
What
sat
we-
out here because I'm batting cleanup.
right.
You're leading
What
off.
we agreed on, we're going this way. All right, everybody? All right. Okay, so I'm Joe Cronyn. I'm with Valbridge Property Advisors, Lipman, Frizzell, and Mitchell. We're a real estate appraisal and consulting firm. I do real estate economics, okay? And that's the reason that I'm here tonight. I'm speaking too loud?
No, you don't have to be standing.
That's great.
Like,
No,
He likes to gesture.
I'm going to whack Mel if I sit down and do my usual gesturing. I'm sorry. I'm a flamboyant personality. Okay, so I've done a lot of work in historic preservation economics. That's the reason I'm here tonight. What I wanted to focus on tonight was how the market drives historic preservation, and then how historic preservation drives the market, okay? We like to think in this capitalist society of ours that we're market-driven, right, ultimately. Well, the reality is that historic preservation is something that sometimes needs a little bit of help, historic preservation tax credits and those kinds of things in order to get people to do the right thing, let's call it, okay? Me, as an individual, I take as an act of faith that historic preservation is a good thing and that we should save the important historic properties in our city. Why? Because it helps us to know where our roots are, all that kind of stuff. That's my act of faith, okay? But, dollars and cents don't necessarily always go with acts of faith. So what I want to talk about tonight is, first of all, some of the real benefits of historic preservation, regardless of where it happens. It's investment, it's money going into the city, and what does that historic preservation do? For every $1 million, and this is based on a study that I did a few years ago, for every $1 million that's invested in the city, in historic preservation, we create 14 jobs. Construction jobs and permanent jobs. Those are, full-time equivalent jobs, all right? So money goes into making jobs directly on the job site, but also, based on, the money that the construction workers spend, the retail jobs that depend on their families' incomes, et cetera, okay? Out of that $1 million, ultimately, $800,000 is cycled through household economy in Baltimore City. So, it's real money in real people's pockets. In addition to the economics of it, okay, we have the my act of faith. The beautiful old structures are worth saving, but we also have environmental benefits. So we, by rehabbing, these historic properties, for every $1 million that's put into rehabilitation, we save 5 acres of green fields that would have been consumed out at the edge of the urban area if we hadn't done something to create economic activity in the interior of the Baltimore region. For every $1 million, we save $500,000 in new infrastructure extension. So instead of building another road or building another sewer out in Carroll County or Harford County or wherever, Baltimore County, okay, we can save that money net by rebuilding in the city where a lot of the infrastructure still exists. And that's sewers, roads, all the schools, all the rest of it, okay? Every $1 million, we reduce demolition debris in landfills, okay? So instead of throwing away a building, we're gonna save that building and we take it easier on our landfills. So those are some of the economic and environmental issues, okay? So what I want to do now is get a little bit more into the weeds, as it were, and give everybody some facts to deal with. I'm a numbers guy. Okay, I didn't print enough copies for everybody. You're allowed to share, okay? If anybody has germs that are really bad, don't share with the, okay? So, yeah, and these folks. So take a look at some of these numbers. So one of the issues in investment, okay, is there anybody in the room here who has an investment where you say, yes, I want to lose money? I want the investment to be worth less next year than it is this year, right? You don't do that, do you? Okay? So when we invest money, we want the investment to create more activity. We want to get some leverage, okay, and make things better not only on, let's say, that historic property site, but also on the properties next to it. We want to have this contagion effect, good contagion, okay? Now look at this, okay? And these are the facts, okay? I got them from the planning department and from the Maryland Historical Trust, okay? And again, the facts are the facts. Let's see where they lead us, though, okay? Look at CHAP permits, the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation, okay? In 2014, there were 699 permits issued, okay? Who got all of the historic preservation permits? Okay, so over half of the permits were in Mount Vernon, Bolton Hill, and Fells Point. Okay, is that a bad thing? No, okay? People take historic preservation seriously, and people are investing in their homes. That's what these permits are for. They're saying, you know, can I do such and such to my house? Okay, and CHAP looks at it and says, yes, you know, we're gonna let you do such and such to your house, whatever it might be. Okay, so what does that first set of numbers show us? It shows where money is going into our community. Are there any surprises there? No. Okay. You know, in the words of the, I'm sorry? City-owned buildings. Okay, 13 of them. You know, we got almost 2% of the permits in city-owned buildings. Okay, but so the issue is, you know, them that has gets, okay, and them that has invests, and that's fine. That's the way our system works. What about the other neighborhoods, though? You know, what about Ashburton? Okay, I mean, what about Barclay Greenmount? What about the Railroad District? Sterling Street. Well, Sterling Street's kind of small, so the 2 is probably not bad for Sterling Street. You know, they've only got, what, 20 or 30 homes?
Yeah.
You know, something like that. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
Sorry, for someone unfamiliar with this, can you explain just what the permit is and
It's basically CHAP telling you that whatever you are proposing to do to your house does not conflict with historic preservation guidelines.
So this would be someone who would apply for.
You have to, if you're in a historic district, these are all historic districts, you have to apply to CHAP in order to do any exterior work on your house. Including paint. Okay? But again, these are all investments, right, in these houses. Okay, so the question is, and I'm asking questions here, okay? What about, you know, the Ashburtons and Auchintoroli Terraces? Auchintoroli Terrace, anybody who's familiar, go into the zoo, wow, those are incredible houses. Okay, well, hey, well, how do we make, you know, the economy work? Okay, how does the market deal with neighborhoods like Ashburton, Auchintoroli Terrace? All right, let's not, because we want to leave time for questions at the end and stuff like that. This is a brain teaser, okay? And the second set of columns, State of Maryland Sustainable Community Investment, okay? This is what used to be called Historic Preservation Tax Credits, okay? The last 5 years, there were 20 projects. You can look at the numbers. Holy moly. $189 million that the state invested, that were the costs involved in projects that the state invested in, okay? And the state invests, let's say, 20% of that amount in addition, or as part of this whole deal, okay? So $189 million in investment in these zip codes, okay? What do we see? Well, of course they're all in the city. This is a city, we're looking at the city.
Yeah, what I see is Fells Point's not very big there.
Fells Point is not very big there. Okay, so the state investments, 2/3 of the state investments are in 3 zip codes: 02, 13, and 11. Okay, boo-hoo. I mean, poor Fells Point. Okay, now, but understand, we've got 3 zip codes that have 2/3 of the money. What does that mean? Okay, how do we get the prosperity, to spread? Are there no historic properties elsewhere in the city? Well, there certainly are.
13 is not the high rent district.
13 is not the high rent district. There are, I think, there are reasons for 13.
Where is 13?
13 is Oliver up to the lower end of
Northeast up Bella Quarter.
right. Okay. Clifton Park area.
That's above
Okay.
Hopkins.
Okay. And I've got the projects that these things are based on, but we'll go top down at this point. Okay. So we're looking at the top level numbers. 2/3 of the money is invested in 3 zip codes. Well, how many zip codes are in the city? 30? Something like that.
Roughly, yeah.
Roughly? Okay. Well, what about the other 27? How do we make historic preservation work elsewhere? Next set of columns. State of Maryland Historic Tax Credit Residential. Unlike the Sustainable Communities money, residential tax credits for the state are pretty much a given. If you're in a historic district, if you're doing work that conforms to historic guidelines, you can, and you have a reasonable rehabilitation plan or something like that, you can get money to assist you in doing historic renovations to a historic building. Okay. Now, if you're an owner occupant, okay. So here's another useful indicator. We've got all of these residential folks. 482, so over almost 100 a year over the past 5 years, okay? So we've got 100 a year for the past 5 years. Where do these investments go? Okay, 3/5 of the investments, almost 60%, are in 4 zip codes: 02, 12, 17, and 18.
Are those lower income zip codes generally? Guilford.
They're mixed.
Guilford and Roland Park.
Not
No.
18.
Okay. 18 is Charles Village, let's say. 17 is Bolton Hill and Reservoir Hill. 12 is Cedarcroft and, okay. And 2 is, a downtown district, okay? So again, I'm not making any judgments on these things. All of this investment is good stuff, okay? Your taxpayer dollars are assisting these people in making renovations to their historic homes, okay? But where do we want our money to go, okay? So zone 15, how many projects there? 1, okay, etc. Okay, you get the idea. You can see where I'm heading. Finally, federal historic tax credits, okay? The last 5 years, 225 projects. These numbers are through the Maryland Historical Trust, and they do not have the dollar amounts that the feds are investing in these projects, okay? Or what these projects' expenses are, okay? However, they do know where the projects are going, all right? 225 projects, so 40 some a year, okay? Where are those monies going?
13.
Right, 1, 2, and 13. Okay, that's where the federal monies are going. And again, these are for income-producing properties, okay? That's the federal rule. And 20% of the qualified rehab cost is being paid by the taxpayer, okay? So these are for thought, okay? Now I'm handing out one other set of things. There are even fewer of these copies. Okay, so the basic question, what's the question?
What's the difference between the two properties?
What's the difference between these two properties? Anybody? That's not a difference.
One's in the county, one's in the city?
No. Okay,
People working on one, they're not working on the other.
One's a developer, one's a property owner.
no.
One's in a historic district and one's
Under
not.
restoration and one is not.
One is under restoration, one is not, okay? So, people recognize the top building? Clifton Mansion, okay? That was just rehabbed on the exterior. It still needs money to redo a lot of the interior, okay? $7 million invested through Civic Works, the nonprofit tenant in the building. The Baltimore City owns the building. It's the former residence of Johns Hopkins, okay? And a really beautiful, gorgeous building. The rehab was amazing, okay? Anybody who hasn't been there, please go. It's wonderful. And they've uncovered amazing things in the rehab. All right, so that building was just redone. I just went to the official opening of the building a month ago or something like that. Okay, the second building, which is?
It's in Jonestown, but it's in an area that's like a no man's land.
Okay, it's a no man's property, no man's land property.
City owned, right?
No, it's privately owned.
Because we pass it every time we go over to Hopkins, and it just jumps out at you because it's so big and so pretty on that land.
It's so big, it's so pretty, and
So
in
empty.
such trouble. It's so empty. It had a fire last summer. It's been vacant and unoccupied for years. What are these two properties? What's the difference between one property and the other property? Okay, the secret answer is the property at the top had an institutional sponsor. Okay, Civic Works took on, because this was their home office, they said, okay, we're going to redo this building, and they raised the money, okay, to redo the city's building. Yes, ma'am?
In partnership, however, I believe, with a Friends of Clifton Mansion Association.
In partnership with Friends of Clifton Mansion, exactly. And it was part of the Hopkins, right. They have all sorts of people who are investing money, including the Hopkins family and the Thompson family and everybody else. Okay, so they have institutional sponsors and community support of a sort, okay? Now, the other building, no institutional sponsor, okay? How do we get that? How do we, make those things work? Because the building at the bottom is an incredibly gorgeous building. How do we save that as part of our heritage? Okay. That building is at the southeast corner of Orleans Street and Central Avenue. Or Asquith Street, I'm sorry, forgive me. Right, exactly, Asquith Street, okay? So that's my time and probably a little bit more. I'm sorry, Mel. Okay.
Thank you. Good evening. As was written in your hymn book there, my name is Mel Freeman, but a disclaimer is I'm the former executive director of CPHA. At the time that I was asked to do this, and I was very excited about it, I was executive director of CPHA, and Rich Hall is now the director. I don't want anything to go back and say, Mel, what happened? But it's been quite some time. So, now, my short component here is social change. And some of the things I'm going to say are really poo-pooing historic preservation, but I want you to just take a deep breath for a moment and just remember that if this were done with 2008 facts on it, my house would be here because I did use historic preservation tax credits for my home in zip code 21218 in 2008. So I have experienced the process, I know how important it is, but it's not exactly equitable all across town. As my colleague alluded to, the haves and the have-nots. A lot of these were in certain zip codes that we all know, but there are approximately 50 different Baltimore City and/or National Historic Register neighborhoods in all of the city. And this list here, it's probably like 30 of them, and the other 20, there were no chat permits, or there was no money spent there. And part of that, in my opinion, just has to do with the fact that it's expensive. I know that when I did my house, I could have very easily said, let me see, I'm going to get 25% back, or 20% back if I spend this much more on this window, but the return on what I had to spend extra doesn't cover it. So at that point in time, I'm doing it for my specific own desire to say, I want to preserve what's here. Not everyone has that opportunity. There are folks that have to make choices about other things, and if it says, I'm going to pay more for something, I'm not going to get it back to save something else. So that's sort of number one. It can be expensive. Number two, the factor that it's like to be said that, it doesn't affect the taxes. Just because your community is a historic designation, that your taxes don't go up. Well, that's true. Until your community starts to increase in value, and then your taxes do go up. Which adds to a point that I am near and dear about, and that is using the G word, gentrification. Truth is, gentrification is really about people being pushed out and being displaced. I care a great deal about using gentrification the right way and the wrong way, and I feel it's really about displacement. And folks are displaced because they can't afford to live where they lived. So gentrification is just a big magic word, but it's really about displacing folks who have lived in a community for a certain period of time, whether they were homeowners or renters. Typically, renters get displaced because their landlords have now discovered that their property is worth more. If their property is now in a historic tax district, all the other properties are increasing in value, and he can make more money, and therefore displacing families, and it's no longer affordable. As it affects homeowners, longtime homeowners in some of these communities, taxes are going to go up. They can no longer afford their homes if their homes they're on a fixed income for that matter. As you know, Baltimore has some very old neighborhoods, and folks have lived in their houses for 20, 30, 50, 60 years, and they're now getting tax bills that are much higher, not to mention all the other things that are going up in costs. So I believe in it, but yet there are lots of things that are byproducts of it. Yeah, the neighborhoods look great. One of the points that's talked about is do they actually build community? Well, of course it's going to build community if you're occupying vacant houses. But in some of the neighborhoods that are the have-nots, there's lots of vacant houses. Well, who's going to invest, again, that extra layer of money in a community where they say there's nothing else around it, in a no man's land? So it's interesting that when you look at this, you can get Federal Hill, Fells Point, and then you jump over to Bolton Hill. It's like, wow, Bolton Hill's doing a lot. But across the road is Reservoir Hill, and you actually don't see Reservoir Hill, but you see two flanking communities of Reservoir Hill that are listed as neighborhoods that are actually doing it, but not nearly at the level of investment as the other neighborhoods. Which brings up another quick point, and that is there's a size of the house issue. A house in Fells Point, to actually reconstruct it, compared, which is approximately, someone give me some square footage here of the house down here. 1,200. Good number, good number. 3,600, 4,000 square feet are some of these other houses in some of these other neighborhoods. The cost to redevelop one of those houses is immense, which means it makes it almost impossible for someone of a middle income, upper middle income, to take one of these houses using housing preservation tax credits, or using any money, because the sheer size of them. So there's a lot of things that are attached to it that's like, well, it's all great, I love it, but it's got some other stuff attached to it. And that's why I think it has an effect on social change. So affordability, community building, if you're trying to do it in a vacant neighborhood, very much community building. Sheer size of them, the gentrification factor, and just the sheer expense of it. But I say that and I remind you of, I did it already, so I know the value of it, but it's not fair to all neighborhoods.
Okay, I'm going to stay seated if you don't mind. There will be questions coming up and discussion, I guess, right after I'm done. Again, Tom Stosur, City Planning Director, and one of the offices and divisions in our planning department is CHAP, the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation. So there is a mayoral appointed commission that oversees the work of CHAP, and the CHAP staff, of which there's 5 members right now, are part of the planning department, and they also staff that commission, which has a very specific orientation and work program to review the projects that are in city historic districts or city designated landmarks, any kind of exterior improvements. So just want to let folks know a few basic facts. We have now 33 distinct local historic districts in the city, and that's protecting over 11,000 different buildings, which is pretty significant. In addition to that, we have 65,000 structures. Some of that overlaps with the other 11,000, but 65,000 structures are in 67 National Register districts. And that's nearly 1/3 of the city with some kind of designation. So renovations in both local and national districts may qualify for the tax credits, but the difference is in CHAP districts, maintaining historic character when you do a renovation is required, because CHAP, that's one of their key functions, review the exterior changes in all those local CHAP districts. In National Register districts, your renovation, in order to get the tax credits, your renovation must meet the standards. But if you decide you're in a National Register district and you don't want to meet the standards, you don't have to, but you don't get the tax credit. So there's an incentive to do it, but yeah, everybody has to do their cost-benefit calculus and see if it makes sense for their situation. But overall, 65,000 structures, that's pretty impressive coverage. But we ask ourselves, well, what about the other 2/3 of the city in the planning department? We want to encourage good development, good urban design, maintaining the urban fabric, whether or not you're designated. And since much of the city's building stock was built before 1950, almost everything is, potentially designatable in some form or another, local or national. But, there are some communities that just really aren't that comfortable or that ready for the rigorous kinds of design review that comes with a CHAP district. So we keep, we're asking ourselves, as we have been rewriting our zoning code, which we're in the process of, and hopefully near the end of in terms of adoption, is there some kind of middle ground where we can put in some guidelines and standards that would at least keep neighborhood character, but without requiring specific review of every single change everybody wants to do, including things like paint color. And in our zoning code rewrite, Transform Baltimore, we are proposing some new standards and tools that I just want to quickly outline so that then we can get to the discussion. First, a few basic facts about this zoning code rewrite, which we call, again, Transform Baltimore. We have not done a rewrite comprehensively in over 40 years. So we're still working from the last zoning code that was written and adopted in 1971. And it's very much a product of its times. That was when sort of the diaspora of population was happening out of the city, and suburbanization was at its peak, running strong. So the code has a lot of things in it that sort of say, well, maybe the city should become more suburban-like, because that's where everybody's going to. And if we do things like big parking lots and larger lots and separating uses, maybe we can compete better with the suburbs. With the rewrite, we've really tried to take a lot of lessons learned on what's been successful in the past few decades with different types of development in the city, incorporating input from community groups, and looking at things like our urban renewal regulations, which sometimes are even before the zoning code they were written, but some of them are still in force. And we really wanted to come up with sort of the sweet spot of streamlining development process so that we can encourage investment, but at the same time setting some baseline rules that says you have to do some decent quality urban design, and we wanted to promote a better mix of uses throughout neighborhoods so that you didn't have to drive everywhere to just serve your basic daily needs. Also, the zoning code includes a complete remapping of all the zoning districts across the city. There's, I think, something in the neighborhood of 250,000 parcels in the city overall. So the code we drafted has been under review by the City Council since October 2012. So they've been looking at it very closely, and and they are finally now, over the past few months, holding specific voting sessions of the Land Use Committee and really dealing with potential amendments. So, and we are hopeful that by early 2016, it's going to be adopted and we can move to these new rules. So what are some of the new tools in there? Some of the most basic moves are simply, when we did that remapping process, make sure the zoning category that we are proposing fits what's on the ground, so that if a neighborhood is all detached houses, its zoning code is consistent with that. Otherwise, you know, you could be able to build a set of row houses, if there's some open land, in the middle of what's otherwise a detached neighborhood. So, and we want to, again, one of our big goals is preserving neighborhood character. So keeping these, you know, kind of out of sync developments from ruining an otherwise attractive fabric. Another big basic piece we're doing is replacing all the business zoning categories. Right now it's B1 through B5 with a new series of commercial categories. The B series that we're operating now basically goes by intensity of uses. So B1, least intense uses, those that are supposed to be next to, right adjacent to a residential district, cafes or little shops, things like that. B3, for instance, is auto-oriented, so service stations, car washes, shopping centers, that kind of thing. And B5 is the downtown district. In our new code, we are proposing basing our commercial districts not only on uses, but on the urban form. Again, a design kind of point of view. So C1, for instance, becomes our Main Street commercial district. So it's not only about the uses in there, it's about making sure those buildings that are in a C1 meet the street, like the nice main streets we have along Washington Boulevard or Highlandtown or 36th Street, you name it. So that, again, you can't plop in the 7-Eleven with parking in the front in the middle of what's an otherwise really great walkable district that has some nice character. And then we have another designation, C3, for shopping centers. We recognize they're going to exist, but there should be design guidelines and landscaping and things that go along with it, and not just a sea of asphalt in front of a strip. Another basic move we've made is to create, for the very first time, an open space zoning category. Right now, believe it or not, all our parks are generally zoned residential. And that kind of sends a little bit of a mixed message. So we want to make sure if it's going to be permanently open space, let's designate it that way. We've also included for the first time design standards and specific landscape standards. I won't go into a lot of that, but right now we basically have to negotiate a lot of that. There are some rules that we overlay. That are imposed by the state, stormwater management regulations, forest conservation. If you're near the shore, critical area. But we've created a landscaping manual that now takes all that into consideration and requires certain landscaping to happen, but we put some templates out there and we're willing to work with folks to customize that. And we have teeth, if this passes, as we're suggesting, that it's required. It's not just optional. A couple of the new tools that I think are really exciting, and again, can preserve the character of neighborhoods. And it's not just about everything being uniform, because some of the character is that we have differentiation within a neighborhood. So in places particularly like Southeast Baltimore here, where it's developed over hundreds of years, you have old church buildings, you have old warehouse buildings, you have tons of corner commercial. Right now, in many cases, all of that is zoned residential. So if you want to put something different in any of those buildings, you have to go through a very cumbersome zoning change process, which requires a city council ordinance, which requires meeting some very specific tests that the state sets about whether a change or mistake has ever happened that could justify changing the zoning. What we're trying to do, again, streamline. If you're going to want to put new types of uses in those kinds of buildings which aren't zoned for anything but residential, there's a limited amount we're suggesting that you could put in there that by a mechanism called conditional use to the zoning board. So instead of taking a year to get a zoning ordinance, you can apply for a zoning board conditional use, which again, public hearing. We, in the planning department, we do a lot of these. We're required to comment on them, and we inform all the impacted community groups. But if you want to reuse that building for a little cafe or an art gallery or something like that, that otherwise maybe you couldn't use, it doesn't lend itself to residential development, you can go to the zoning board. There is a process, it's called conditional use because you can set conditions on how that property would be utilized. Things like some design considerations, hours of operation, and a host of other things, parking. And if the zoning board and the owner both agree with those conditions, then it's set, and you can sort of have some reasonable limitations on how that building would be used. But you might, hopefully the goal is you're preserving a structure that's part of the history of the neighborhood that otherwise might stay vacant because you just can't get the return you need out of purely residential. We have similar kinds of mixed use ideas for both row house and detached structures that are on high traffic corridors. Think of maybe 25th Street by Calvert, or think of Liberty Heights Avenue going out in northwest Baltimore. Maybe those aren't the most attractive places if they're zoned residential to just have residential uses. And so they're not kept up well, or they're stay vacant. We're suggesting that there's a mechanism we're putting in as an overlay district that the council would have to approve, but called residential mixed use or detached dwelling mixed use. So on the first floor, do an office, you can have some shops above, do a small shop, and residential above. We also have industrial mixed use category for the first time, and again, it's geared towards buildings that, in the old days, the printing shops and things, the copycat building, they're 8 or 10 stories tall, beautiful buildings, and a lot of them are surrounded by residential. Let's allow kind of live work spaces, maybe artisan spaces. Right now, it takes a lot to get those kind of uses in. We want to proactively rezone those buildings to this industrial mixed use designation. So if you want to do those live work artist spaces, you fulfill the requirements, you can get your permit to go ahead and do it. You don't have to wait a year for a zoning change. We have new waterfront overlay zoning districts that want to preserve waterfront views, keep up, and instead of right now, our whole promenade system is based on a bunch of easements in urban renewal plans. We want to put it in the zoning code. You must, if you're going to develop on the waterfront, you must provide this promenade and continue what we have. And we even set up 2 different categories, continuing along the Inner Harbor and Canton and Fells Point, a hardscape kind of version, and then for what's going to be an amazing place as it gets developed, the Middle Branch, a softer scape version that you can mix in some wetlands and some boardwalks, but we still want to maintain that policy of pedestrian access to the waterfront. So I'll kind of end it there, but there's other tools for campus zones, again, specialized for hospitals and education, transit-oriented development zones. These are all brand new tools that are not in our 1971 code that we think are going to help with both mixing uses, promoting investment, but requiring really good design as well.
Well, great. Well, it's hard to be a moderator when people aren't very extreme. I don't know how much moderating they need. I'm Charlie Duff, and I'm a developer and a planner on a nonprofit basis. I run a thing called Jubilee, Baltimore. If you're wondering why there have been so many historic tax credit projects at Mount Vernon, it's because we did about half of them. And we're now mainly active in Station North. Personally, I got interested in this right here when I was 15 years old in Fells Point in the early years of the road fight. And when I think about what preservation has done in Baltimore in my lifetime, or at least since I was 15, I can think of 4 things that are visible to the naked eye, my naked eyes, right here, 4 things that I can see. The first is that you've got a preservation forum on Fells Point that includes the planning director of the city of Baltimore. When I was 15 years old, the city of Baltimore was our enemy, and the planning department wasn't on our side. There was this ragtag and bobtail group of people, David Gleason, and Romaine Somerville, who's in the back row, where are you? Was the first director of CHAP. I interviewed you when I was a 10th grader writing a term paper about Fells Point. And so you were an 11th grader, but so it was hard to get you to talk to me. 11th grade girls never talk to 10th grade boys. But so the first thing is that the city of Baltimore now thinks that preservation is important enough for the director of planning to be part of a conversation like this. Second thing is that we're here on a podium that includes an African American. I don't think that ever happened with preservation or anything else when I was 15 years old. And it's now something that people kind of take for granted. And we're beginning, at 15, when I was 15, nobody asked whether African Americans cared about the architectural heritage of Baltimore. That seemed a very frivolous issue. I was 15 years old in 1968. That seemed a very frivolous issue. And now, Mel, you frame a new issue, which is there are more historic tax credit projects in white neighborhoods than there are in black neighborhoods, more in rich neighborhoods than there are in poor neighborhoods, and what can we do to fix that? And that's new. That's really quite different. The third thing is that Joe Cronyn is here. And Joe is a real estate market analyst and works for developers who want to do projects. Well, ladies and gentlemen, David Gleason was right at the beginning of this. At the beginning of the road fight, when I was 15 years old and Romaine was 16, nobody like Joe Cronyn cared about a place like Fells Point. Joe gave a whole talk about the economics of preservation. Preservation didn't used to have economics. Preservation has economics, and that's a big change. And then there's the fourth change. We're meeting here on Fells Point. If there hadn't been a big change, there wouldn't be a Fells Point for us to meet in. We would be sitting under an 8-lane extension of I-83. So when you think about Fells Point, you can think about individual buildings, but I'm supposed to ask these guys a question. So I want to ask a question that tries to be about as general as possible. You ready? Suppose there had been no historic preservation movement. Suppose nobody had tried to make people like old buildings or subsidize people for fixing them up. How would Baltimore be different?
Well, I think we'd have a lot less fabric to even talk about, because people could willy-nilly take things down just whenever it was expedient or convenient for them, and it would, sort of have destroyed that kind of collective public good of keeping things intact as a whole.
We'd probably look very suburban-like and a lot like Houston, which still to this day doesn't have any zoning that causes anyone to build anything like what's next to it. So you could have a junkyard, literally a junkyard, and then a house, and then a 15-story building, all right next to each other. So I think that has helped try and give us a skyline that is at least acceptable, reliable, something like that. I mean, it's helped keep that look of Baltimore.
I'd say we'd be boring. Whatever else you want to say about Baltimore, we're not boring. Really. And if you don't have, beautiful historic places, if you don't have neighborhoods with character, you just become Houston. You become the Avenue at White Marsh. Whatever. Okay. We wouldn't be quite the same wonderful characters that we are here in this town. Does everybody else like Laura Lipman?
Sure.
Okay. Talk about quirky character, right? Ann Tyler. They would have nothing to write about if we didn't have, historic neighborhoods with quirky people like, all the wonderful people in this room. There you go.
There you go. Okay, well, I've shot my bolt. How about you?
Well, I'd like to answer that question. Basically, without historic preservation, I think Baltimore would be a drastically different city, and mainly because what Baltimore didn't have in the 40s and 50s was a serious downtown residential area. And what the stopping of the roads, basically they stopped the roads because they created historic districts, and you can't use federal money to tear out those, so they couldn't use federal money to tear down the old houses. So it required them to put back residential. And without people putting in, Federal Hill and Fells Point started it, and Otterbein, without having residential there, then we wouldn't have places like the other residential that came up. And downtown right now, we're getting this influx of 20-year-olds coming in here. They wouldn't be
Maybe 24-year-olds.
Well, whatever. They wouldn't be coming down here because the seed of the preservation movement created, say, yes, you can live here. Mm-hmm. And before that, everything would have been commercial.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. Who else is on this? We'll go over here.
Yeah, I was wondering if
you guys could speak to the topic of rentals versus ownership, and in terms of both city development and community development, we speak to communities that are established and have a very tight-knit fabric, and how perhaps rentals may not disrupt, but change that kind of character. If there are regulations about rentals, or if that's a thought going into the process of development, and what the prospects are for economics and.
Okay, first of all, moderator's privilege. Could you all hear that question? Okay, the question, let me try to summarize it, is ownership versus rental in preservation, in zoning, in economics. Is that fair? Is there a, is one better than the other, or where do you want to go with this?
If it's on the mind in the development process, but I mean, granted, individuals who may stay at a property for a year or two would certainly bring in economic development, but aren't necessarily going to yield great prospects for this kind of a close-knit kind of community, wouldn't be invested in historical development.
Okay, with an additional wrinkle of neighborhood character that if people stay for a year or two, they may bring economic development, but they may not be part of a weaving together of a neighborhood. Who's the first shot?
Whoops. Okay, you had your hand up, sir. Go ahead.
Renters are people too. You have to be very careful with that conversation. Although Baltimore City has an extremely high home ownership rate, or we have in the past, it's not what it used to be. I think somewhere in the lines of 60 to 70%, which is pretty high. And lower?
We're about 45
now. But we were much higher before. And there are lots and lots of communities that are very strongly renter-invested families. Families that have rented properties in many of the neighborhoods I've worked in that have rented properties for 40 some odd years, which is actually not good. But yeah, you'd be surprised how strong some of the neighborhoods are in the city that have a higher number of renters, and their ownership and their relationship building that they have in the community, where they're the ones that are out there sweeping the street, but they're renters, and that's just simply the lifestyle that they have, or the lane that they've been allowed to be in.
Just a couple comments. Zoning itself, we always say this as a principle, it's about the what, not the who. So it's about uses, it's not about who owns something in terms of zoning. So residential, zoning doesn't discriminate about is it a homeowner or a renter in a particular building. And that's a basic fundamental, and in fact it's probably illegal from Federal Fair Housing Act to try to pass some kind of city regulation that would require it in one place or another. So there's a lot of, a lot of implications to that. But the other piece is, a lot of what determines what gets developed is demand and what's available for financing and things like that. And rental projects, particularly dense rental projects, right now have been very financeable for the past several years, whereas doing a home ownership development, because of the real estate bust, really tight credit rules, so people can't even qualify for mortgages like they used to, there's a lot of implications as to why someone as an individual might not be able to pursue a home ownership opportunity. What we want to be is a city that has enough variety that we allow for all of that to happen. And I do think we need some new home ownership products in the city, and we have some potential major redevelopment areas that we're acquiring property, clearing it. Park Heights is an example, where we're building 2 new schools that are funded, a new rec center and park complex, and we're just about finished acquiring 60 acres of land, which is not easy to come by in the city of Baltimore. So we're hoping to be able to have some new home ownership opportunities there for affordable, middle-income kind of workforce housing in the future.
Joe, anything?
No, I don't have anything to add. I mean, during the Bush years, home ownership, as we found, went to the extreme. I mean, there are a lot of folks who realistically shouldn't have been homeowners as the bubble got to the top of the, of the housing market. So we have to make room for everybody. And the issue, for example, is not necessarily the renter, it's the owner of the building, it's the investor in the building who has a responsibility for keeping a building up and making sure that in addition to the resident keeping with, let's call it, neighborhood norms, also the investor, the owner of the property, has to keep a property up and keep things rolling too.
Okay. Let's see, who's next? All right. I don't know who's next. I think you're next, standing up.
I have a question to
We'll all get there.
Mr. Cronyn. One thing I've always felt is that I'd like to say I appreciate tremendously your passion for preservation. I'd also like to say that it seems as though as we look at economic development and we look at opportunities in the city, that there's one thing I think has been missed, is that be it realtors, whomever, to say that the people who are coming into areas like Fells Point, you have a wonderful opportunity to have certain protections, which I'd like to see more in CPHA. Not CPHA. Excuse me, in CHAP. I'll move it over. I'll move it over one notch, because I think CHAP has been diminished politicized over the years. But I'd love to see realtors say to people, you have a wonderful opportunity, be it historic tax credits, be it one thing or another, be it CHAP controls, that you have the opportunity to have your investment protected by controls that preserve historic preservation, that preserve height limitations, that preserve a community. And that needs to be bolstered, it needs to be employed. I think every real estate company needs to put out, collectively maybe, put out a brochure saying, gosh, you are lucky you are in this historic district. And I'd just like your perspective of it.
No, I mean, all the statistics show that the property values in historic districts are higher than in similar unprotected areas, all that kind of stuff. So I'd say some of that goes to maybe the professionalism of the real estate sales force and trying to make sure that people are trained. Also for neighborhood advocates, trying to talk with the people who are the agents who are principally representing their area, going in and really training them in terms of the neighborhood dialogue. The real estate agents want to sell houses, and neighborhood folks want to sell houses. So there's a natural marriage here, where there can be a little more education given to increase the sales skills, because that's very definitely a selling point. As somebody is thinking about buying in Baltimore City, if you buy in a historic district, there's definitely more protection to the value that you've got in that house. Okay, great.
Great. Okay, somebody we haven't heard from yet. Yes, over there. No, you. Blue shirt. You.
Oh, okay. Wasn't sure which you we were talking about.
I know.
Okay. So, I guess this is mostly directed to Mr. Stosur. And it's about Transform Baltimore. And there are probably a lot of people in this room who are perhaps blessedly less knowledgeable than I've become over the last couple of weeks about this, and I wish I could say that I was as naive as I had been a couple weeks ago, but I'm not. So let's deal with a couple of things about some of the things that you said. C1 categories you actually described as for Main Street uses. So my first question is, given that we have a historic district here in Fells Point, how does, by conditional use, a 60-foot tall building fit in with a Main Street concept? In my mind, it doesn't. Main Street should be smaller buildings. 60 feet is completely out of scale with most of the buildings in this area. I'd also like to say about the C2 category, which at least is on the very fringe of the historic district, which allows by conditional use buildings up to 100 feet. Completely out of scale with everything that's around it. You talk about conditional use, and I think there are a lot of people here who don't understand about conditional use because it sounds really good the way you described it. In reality, it doesn't work that way. I live in the world of reality. I go to BMZA hearings on conditional use, and very rarely do the residents win. Very rarely, even with attorneys and even with large numbers of residents saying, we oppose this conditional use, do the residents actually win, and more often than not, the BMZA sides with the developer. What that does is that places an unfair burden on every single one of us here who have invested in living and working in a historic community to have to constantly fight what really feels like a losing battle. So I don't really understand how, if one of your goals is preserving the character of a neighborhood, how you can even conceive of putting in buildings that by conditional use could go 60 to 100 feet.
Now I feel I'm back on Phil's Point.
Okay, well, I can appreciate your viewpoint. I don't necessarily agree with it.
Well, we want to hear how you justify what you have done.
Okay, here you go. You're a protected local CHAP district, so not only do you have zoning rules that are in place, and again, a conditional use is not automatic, and I've seen things work great in terms of community input and decisions at the zoning board, and I've seen a handful that didn't work out so great in terms of the community viewpoint, but they're in the position of every city official. We don't have the luxury of taking one particular point of view. It's all a balancing act, and we have to allow enough flexibility to happen, but I would put forth there are sufficient controls with conditional uses, and particularly in a place like Fells Point with design review, that you have to get through the CHAP commission in order to build a building of any kind, whether it stays at 30 feet. You can have there can be ugly 30 feet tall buildings, there can be beautiful 60-foot tall buildings, and there's plenty of room around our main streets for a variety. We want to have places where folks are putting more residential uses to encourage that walkability. Density is what a city is about, and we believe that density is good for Baltimore if it's well designed and it's balanced. And every case is very specific, and that's why you can specifically have some conditional use pieces on operational issues, which typically zoning doesn't allow, and there is urban design review as a much more important piece of our zoning code, and then there's the whole CHAP protection as well. The CHAP Commission can reject a building that it thinks is out of character, and they are the last word in terms of a historic district.
Hold
on.
Say a follow-up about that is that we have some very clear examples in Fells Point where in my opinion, CHAP has let us down. One of them are the two tall apartment buildings in the 600 block of Broadway. They are ugly. They add nothing to the skyline of Fells Point. And because they're taller than the surrounding structures, we have no choice but to see them. They're not well done. The materials are, in my opinion, ugly. And they don't add anything. They don't enhance our skyline. The other thing is, and I kind of know how this happened, but if you go to the 1700 block of Alisana Street, the weird building front of Louisiana fits nothing in the neighborhood. And that guy kept bullying and bullying and bullying design review and finally did what he wanted. And now we have weird columns and weird colors and, you know, it doesn't fit. So from my point of view, from living here since 1979, what I've seen is we can't depend on CHAP. We can't depend on the BMCA. We can't necessarily depend on the way the design review works because there are other factors that come into play that seem to have more power than the power of the people who actually live here.
Okay. Back row over there.
Yes, to follow up on what Joanne had to say, I think it's inherently wrong when the chairman of CHAP designs a building, saying, of course, that he will recuse himself, designs a building that's almost 60 foot tall in our historic district. That's just not right. In addition to that, since 2008, CHAP has allowed the demolition of 36 historic buildings, including 2 18th century buildings. That's inexcusable. I don't care what the development is, those buildings should have been adaptively reused. That is just wrong. C1 and C2 designation, there should be no C2 within the historic district, none whatsoever. 100 feet within the historic district, next to historic buildings, is wrong by all of the principles of preservation that there are, including the national standards.
Hang on, let me just ask, are there any questions out there for other members of the panel? Let's just have a little bit for somebody else. Okay, we'll try you.
I have a question for Joe. Do you know what the economics are for the historic preservation impact? How many tourism dollars it brings in?
Well, I mean, it really depends on where the building is, etc. I can tell you, I mean, I've talked with people, for example, at the Waterfront Partnership, and their guides, okay, everybody understands the Waterfront Partnership down near the Inner Harbor. The number given me a while back, I think probably a year ago, was that what was the number one question asked of the Waterfront Partnership guides who were, you know, how to get to Fells Point. Yeah. Okay, and I forget what the percentage was, but it was like, I don't know, well over half of the questions asked of the waterfront guides was how to get to Fells Point. That, you know, right there speaks wonders about the value of historic tourism, particularly in a place like Baltimore, where we've been able to maintain the character of a neighborhood like this and be able to draw people. Why do they come here? Well, geez, you know, here we are.
Okay. Okay, somebody we haven't heard from you. What, one last question? Okay, one last question. Romaine, my 11th grade girl.
Right. That was some time ago. I have been active in historic preservation for 65 years, 55 of them here in Baltimore. One of my major concerns during this whole time was the use of gentrification and displacement to criticize historic preservation. Well, first of all, I can tell you that when I began to work in Fells Point and Federal Hill and Otterbein, and I have photographs to prove it, it was vacant house after vacant house after vacant house. Nobody was displaced in any of those neighborhoods. And when I moved into Bolton Hill in 1962, The 2 houses on each side of us were vacant, and the one that we bought had been vacant for 10 years. Displacing people is not a problem in Baltimore. What I can't understand is if you get neighborhoods that are paying more taxes, property tax, and paying more income tax because you brought in people who have rehabbed houses and they are contributing majorly to the city coffers, why can't you move these people who are supposed to be being displaced from their substandard housing and build something decent for them in a good neighborhood? Where is this money going that we preservationists are bringing into the city? I know that the taxes, I did a study with a real estate person, and then he asked me not to publish it. And that is that the people in Federal Hill were paying 10 times more tax than the people in the Inner Harbor, because the Inner Harbor new building, this, and of course you have to realize I'm talking about 55 years of work, so things might have changed. They had so many tax advantages and discounts and incentives to come and build in the Inner Harbor that they were living off the backs of the people in places like Federal Hill, whose taxes went up enormously. And if you're really concerned about displacement, you should not raise the taxes on a property, particularly in a neighborhood that has a mixed community, as all the historic districts do, until the person sells it. And at that time, it'll be the next person, the person who has enough money to buy the property, who will pay the heavy tax.
Okay, that's our last question, but we haven't had our last answer.
I just have
Oh.
one more thing to add. I was at CHAP, I think, for 10 years as director. I will tell you, all the mayor has to do is say no, and whatever decision CHAP made goes down the drain.
That's right.
I'd
like to say just one more thing.
Hold on, we have to answer, there's a question on the floor, we'll get there.
I think that I want to connect 2 of the points that you made. And I hear, but when you talk about saying that why can't there be affordable housing for these folks somewhere else?
In Baltimore, we need more population in Baltimore.
I get a lot of angst here, because now you're saying, why do those folks not have the same walkability as you in this great community?
No. There's
Yes.
lots of walkable communities in Baltimore.
Okay, well, I'll let that one go as well.
They can put them north of Fells Point, north of Canton, or mix them in those districts.
Again, you're removing them from this community.
It's not a walkable community, I can tell you.
And the other point, you said that people aren't being displaced, and I did preface that by saying the market is what displaces people. If there's a landlord in any community that can garner higher rents, people will be displaced. And since there aren't enough affordable housing units in town, and our increasing valued neighborhoods are creating less and less places for families of lesser means, have to move elsewhere to other neighborhoods that have poor transportation, poor schools, you name it. So having a mixed income,
if we're getting more income from these awful people who are paying higher taxes, the gentry.
So the gentry.
I have an idea here, because this is running kind of low.
working
No, hold
the
on.
whole
I'm not
thing
going to moderate an argument, but I think a discussion between individuals could work. We're going to be here for a while. There's food and drink in there. I'm tired of sitting down, and we probably are too. You can have at us. It's time to go.
Well, yes, I'd like to thank everybody for coming this evening, and I'd like to thank our panelists.
Yes.
Because I think they've done a wonderful job. The discussion can continue. There's food and drink, but we're going to conclude the 4 o'clock. If you will do that for me, please.